Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the biopathic method, where we harmonize naturopathy and allopathy or contropathy, where the latter is all about removing distortions, equates removing and masking distortions, equating the dis well, equating healing or curing with removing or eliminating the distortion, not just symptomologically, but causally. Whereas, the former, naturopathy, has to do with it equates healing with preventing. And that's also incomplete. Both of these methods are incomplete. When you fuse them, you get a new method, which is biopathy. Now, we can call this method any name. The real thrust is to harmonize parametric, contrapathic causation with programmatic causation, which naturopathy attempts, approaches, and approximates, but cannot fully capture because preventing is still tailored to linear time. You prevent something before it happens, which means that we're still acting as though we're physical objects that have supervenient mind complexes and whose spirit complexes are totally absent. Something that is fictitious or wishful thinking, but in fact doesn't exist. We don't have true souls. What is a soul? Well, simplistically, it's the mapping between a body and a mind. Okay, a body is a product, a parameterized product, and a mind is the property that characterizes the parameter in isolation, but in fact is instantiated by the product or object. So we have products or body complexes, programs or properties being mind complexes. Their coupling is the programming and processing and displaying associated with the soul or the spirit complex. If we want to consider it even metaphorically, we can think of the body complexes winnowing out distortions and selecting preferences based on mind complex processing and spirit complex programming, where programming is wishing and processing is willing. Now, you can, play with these terms, right? Where you can think of processing as also being wishing and programming as willing, but in the end, what we're really doing is trying to relax our terminology a little bit. Yes, we have to get technical in certain parts, but we also want to be poetic and cryptic because we need to instigate medical practitioners. We need to understand that medical science is based on parametric causation and linear time, and this means that it is overlooking the metaphysical or ontological requirements of body complexes. We are not just body complexes, we are body, mind, spirit complexes. We are self-dual between, we have self-dualities that we're not considering. For example, there's a self-duality between product, property, and operation or process. This is being totally left out of consideration. We equate, first of all, we distinguish objects and states. We say that an object has certain states. We, sequence those states and call that a process, right? And we think of properties as attributes that humans and, researchers identify and use to study objects in sequence. That, in a nutshell, is parametric causation in linear time, right? The objects are moving in linear time. They're the different forms of motion, right? We have, extremely simplistic forms of motion, but when you start getting into things like the Krebs cycle or, mitotic self-division, we start getting into extremely complex and intricate forms of motion, involving many, many variables and parameters. But in the end, we're dealing with parametric causation in linear time, which is all about quantifying different measurements. And this, unfortunately, is simply not going to do. It is incomplete. It is metaphysically infantile. And again, I'm not trying to be insulting, right? Anybody can look at me and say, well, this guy doesn't have a medical degree. What does he know? That's correct. I don't have a medical degree. My sister has a medical degree, and we've discussed this many times, and she agrees that parametric causation in linear time, according to quantitative measures, is simply incomplete. Now, what do we need? We need to supplement programmatic causation, which distributes programs over sequences, which distributes properties over their instances, over their states, where states are now equivalent to physical objects. Physical objects are now body complexes. Body complexes intersect through mind complexes structurally, relationally, and they transform operationally through what are called spirit complexes or souls. Now, again, if you don't like those terms, we can use technical terms such as self-dual operators, self-dual teleodynamic operators that, again, have elemental, relational, and operational aspects of structure, dynamics, and programming, respectively. I mean, we can, talk in those terms, or we can talk in more poetic terms. In the end, we're going to have to fuse these terms because the biopathic method is not a purely technical method. Natural language is what I like to call verbal telepathy, right? Well, where verb or verbatim is word to word communication, right? I don't like the linguistic is etymologically limited because it has to do with the actual tongue, and of course excludes sign language and other forms of natural language. So, but basically, natural language is a form of verbal telepathy where the percepts are verbal percepts, word forms and phrases and clauses and sentences and so forth, and these are emitted in sequence. Even if you're a signer and you can set up different points in space and you can sort of use parallelism, you're still sequencing in the sense that you're progressing from state to state to state to state. We are not programming our natural language expressions in sequence. We're using non-terminals, right? We're using syntactic forms that distribute grammatical and lexical categories that distribute over different types of word, different types of clause, different types of phrase, and so forth. So we already experience programmatic causation, and this is causing a lot of difficulties with respect to what we call free will and consciousness and so forth. But we don't want to wrap in those terms yet. That is quite a morass. Now, programmatic causation, when coupled with parametric causation, forms what we've been calling metacausation, which again is both sequential and non-sequential or distributive, where programs and properties are distributing over instances or objects. And this means that we are now generalizing evolution. The term evolution, unfortunately, is not equivalent with state transformation or the infusion of the infusion of properties through states. Properties cannot interact with each other. Right? If you have the property of solidity and the property of liquidity, they don't interact with each other unless you have an object which can exhibit both of those properties or which can intersect through a solid and liquid object. For example, water instantiates both solidity and liquidity. Or you can have a solid object like a marble, which is immersed in a puddle of water, and now you have the interaction between the properties solidity and liquidity. But on their own, properties without instances can't interact. They're little islands. And this means that, until we start allowing for properties to intersect through objects, we cannot understand why distortions in the form of injury, illness, right? Whether it's a malfunction of some process, an invasion of some pathogenic invasion of some process, a toxicological accumulation that is causing malfunctions or compromising the immune system in some way that allows for invasions. And what this means is that we're going to continue to think that distortions in the form of illness, injury, and accumulation or untoward circumstance are randomized, mechanized forms of causation, right? Why does a mutation that results in carcinogenesis occur? Well, you can either think of it randomly or mechanically. You can think of it randomly in the sense that, well, given these higher order prerogatives of an organism, right? For example, a human organism, I have the ambition that I want to be a lawyer, but all of a sudden this mutation in my body happens that conspires and stops me from being a lawyer. We would say that with respect to the goal of being a lawyer, with respect to human prerogatives such as, being a lawyer, getting married and things like that, that mutation is random. With respect to the actual, on the level, on the stratum of that matter element, right? Whether it's, there are many ways that carcinogenesis can get triggered, but, whichever one we want to pick, then we can think of it as, a mechanical process where, certain causes, certain complex causes map into certain complex effects that, again, when we say complex effect, we mean that, instance of carcinogenesis can, you know, cause extremely complex effects in the physical body, right? Which are not just cytological, but histological, organological, and so forth. And of course, ultimately physiological in the sense that we have a symptomology of the carcinogenesis, and psychological, this being more of a symbology. We don't usually think, oh, wait, but maybe, just maybe, the mind and spirit complex feedback is inducing the circumstances of carcinogenesis. That's too large of a leap, unfortunately. We can't actually make that leap until we have elevated evolution to state transformation appropriate to some stratum of syntax, where syntax is governing state transformation both sequentially from state to state to state, cause effect, cause effect, cause effect, no matter how many complex causes you want to map into effects, and distributively by mapping programs, by basically a program, to use a computer analogy, is to enter commands. The programmer enters, or literally programs, configures commands that are deterministic instructions of the computer, and the computer, of course, is basically an ensemble of its processor, CPU, and its monitor, its display, whatever kind of display it has, whatever appears in the display, okay, is not being caused sequentially. A programmer can configure a command or can execute a program in such a way that certain steps in the program are not being actualized adjacently, which means that, for example, a programmer such as, and this is getting a little bit abstract, but the programmers that we're discussing are self-dual teleodynamic operators, right? As we defined a self-dual operator previously. And they are entering or configuring commands in the form of property product couplings, okay? And those couplings have a causal symmetry, just as, in quantum theory, we talk about time symmetry. Well, when we're talking about coupling parametric and programmatic causation, we need to start talking about causal symmetry or metacausal symmetry, where programming can actually backwardly, retrocausally, really metacausally, because retrocausation is a sort of sequential time reversal, and this is not a sequential time reversal, can configure certain parameters which turn out to be circumstances in which instances or products, can behave in ways that appear deterministic from the perspective of the programmer and appear non-deterministic from the perspective of those products, right? And in fact, could be totally undecidable. But in fact, what is happening is there's a self-deterministic process happening, which is from the bottom up emergent in a sequential sense, and from the top down is, we can say, stratified in a programmatic sense. But again, this programming is hyper-computational or proto-computational. It involves programmers that are not merely computational programmers. So when we're talking about, these self-dual teleodynamic operators, we're talking about programmers that are proto-computational. And proto-computation is a new kind of process to humans. Everything is happening proto-computationally in the sense that you have a causal symmetry between programs and products in the form of product property couplings. The coupling is the symmetry. When the coupling starts to emerge through the products, through behaviors or motion, state-to-state transformations of body complexes, we start talking about, non-deterministic or stochastic dynamics. When we're talking about the actual execution, the top-down execution of that program, then we start talking about, deterministic retrocausation. But both of those are incomplete, right? Just as the naturopathic method and the allopathic or contrapathic method are incomplete. Now, it turns out that the biopathic method has a general analog applicable to the hybridization of axiomatic and scientific method, right? Where axiomatic method is basically a top-down method. You program axioms, and then the axioms constrain, you can, let's not, I already defined this in part one, but basically the axiomatic method is a top-down method, and the scientific method is a bottom-up method where you start with observations of brute facts. And if you follow the scientific method, you can never have a definite definition of reality. Your definition of reality is always going to change based on new brute facts that you observe, and you are simply open to whatever nature the universe can ultimately be. Whereas if you axiomatize nature, then you're basically only assuming what nature can be. So, on the one hand, you're assuming what nature can be axiomatically, you're defining nature, right? And technically, you can define nature in an invariant sense, but you need something called the syntactic method, where you're forming a self-generative syntax that basically establishes couplings or mappings between axioms and observations, between axioms and theorems, where observations are elevated to the status of theorems, because now we have this coupling of non-terminal and terminal domains that we've also discussed. Now, I hope we're not overloading you with the terminology here, right? But anyway, the biopathic method is just a medical application of the syntactic method, which is the general method of, well, we can say, of selecting axioms and generating the theorems. You generate the cause on the basis of whatever effect you have selected. That's why self-dual operators, these body-mind-spirit complexes, are teleodynamic. They're not just teleological, they also have dynamism to them. So, that's why we call them teleodynamic. And of course, two individuals have used that term. The first one is Terence Deacon. The second one is Chris Langan. They use them, Terence Deacon uses it in a biological context, and Langan uses it in a metaphysical context. We need both, right? Just as we need the syntactic method appropriate to metaphysics, we need the biopathic method appropriate to medical science. All right, now here's where this all comes together, where you have a causal symmetry, a metacausal symmetry between properties and products, right? You've got these couplings. The properties double as symbologies, and the products double as symptomologies. So we're actually extending what a symptomology is down to the molecular level, in fact, the atomic level. So atomic, molecular, cellular, and so forth behaviors, right? You start getting into tissues and organ systems and biological systems, all correspond to body complexes, and body complexes behave in such a manner that they generate symptomologies. Okay, so if you restrict your study to body complexes, you're basically restricting yourself to the scientific method. And you're beginning with brute facts, right? Those brute facts are the observations of body complexes. You're generating some kind of theory that is, of course, abstract, but you're just going to overlook that because that's just something that you as a human researcher are peculiarly inserting into, the system, right? And of course, the system is supposed to be unbiased. So your theory, if it's incorrect, has to get discarded, for example. But the theory is an abstract apparatus that you're sort of excluding from the observation, right? Your formulations of the theory are excluded from the observations, even though there has to be some kind of isomorphism between them. But never mind that. Then you go on your merry way and start, you describe the system using a descriptive theory. You start to try to predict or explain that system and its behavior. That's all symptomological. Okay? Now, the mind complex is all about generating a symbology that, again, you have a property-product coupling, which in fact, when complexified, right, when emergently/distributively complexified, you have a symptomology-symbology coupling. And so, in fact, what the biopathic method instructs us to do is basically take whatever's happening on body complex levels, right? Again, we're talking about atoms, molecules, cells, etc. Those are all body complexes, and they're terminally confined. And we have to start developing that into a stratified symptomology corresponding to a distributive symbology. And when we start to think in these terms, we start to understand that distortions of the body complex flow downward they flow metacausally, in the sense that We are programming. When I say we, I mean not our little body complexes, but the body, mind, spirit complexes into which we figure and to which we correspond on a metaphysical level. And of course, this takes a tremendous amount of legwork that we haven't, actually done in this series. And in fact, we need to release written publications to really stabilize all of this terminology, and in fact, introduce a new kind of self-dual notation that is appropriate to the syntactic method, right? But anyway, the more generally, right, the product property couplings. Those are something we can talk in terms of the biopathic method, but if you want to generalize it to the syntactic method, the products are actually the theorems and the properties are the axioms. So we have, and of course, they're adjoint because, in a metaphysical system, you have to have meta-axioms that are self-dual to each other in order for the system to be closed under self-selection and self-generation. Self-generation from the bottom up, self-selection from the top down. You have top-down, bottom-up closure. There's a lot of paradoxes that get resolved, right? The paradox between constructability from the bottom up and definability from the top down get resolved because, you have this closed system. Anyway, this closed system can only be studied through the syntactic method as we define. Of course, syntax is, not mechanistic syntax. It's generative, self-generative syntax, which of course includes a self-selective power. At the same time, let's stabilize. The self-selective power is the programming level of freedom. The self-generative power has to do with the executive level of freedom. So when we're incarnate, right, when we're confined to the terminal domain, we have this terminal consciousness, right, which is what I'm using, which is what you're using, etc. We're disjoint. Our consciousness is not distributive. We're disjoint from all the body complexes that compose us and their conscious states, right? Now, this, of course, implies a distributive kind of panpsychism. But anyway, this has to do with executive freedom. We're executing whatever is relevant or salient to our terminal consciousness. And when symptoms become salient, what the biopathic method instructs us to do is link them with symbols. Now, this is where things seem to get wishy-washy, but in fact, if you start experimenting on yourself, you'll realize that your symptoms, and here I'm talking about the physiological level of symptom, as well as the psychological level of symptom, correspond to an entire symbology that has to do with your non-terminal analog and what it is programming you to execute. Now, this is not a deterministic type of situation. Once again, it is self-deterministic because you are both executive and programmatic. Your executive's parametric, meaning you're executing on the basis of parameters that you've already programmed. And this programming is what I like to call gestational and circumstantial programming from within the non-terminal domain. Okay, this is getting a little bit chaotic here. Let me take a moment here because I don't have any notes. And again, using a kind of self-dual syntactic method implies that you have to ping pong a lot. So I hope this is not getting too unintelligible. Now, I mentioned experimentation. Let me share a little bit of personal testimony. In 2020, February of 2020, right? Actually, let me back up. In January of 2020, I was teaching 6th, 7th, and 8th grade. And the school that I was working at and still am working at had just opened in 2016. So it was a brand new school. I basically had complete freedom in the curriculum that I could construct and the methods that I could use to teach. Now, this was a lot of work, but this is a separate story, but extremely synchronistic as to my own personality. I work best when I have complete freedom. This is why school didn't really work too well for me. And anyway, I was working with 6th, 7th, and 8th grade teachers. And we had a kind of a co-teaching situation. And one of the 7th grade co-teacher was, I knew, extremely unhappy. They'd moved from high school down to seventh grade, and seventh grade is arguably developmentally the most difficult grade. And so, this person basically notified me in January that they were going to quit and that they were going to move to another school. And I said, okay, well, good luck, and I hope, I wish them well, and thank them for letting me know. And basically, what happened was I was determined to be the person who could take on that this teacher's entire class load, in addition to also helping out with the other this sixth and eighth grade teachers. That angered me. I was not happy about that, and I was lashing out to students because the situation was one in which I co-taught some classes with this teacher, but the other classes were the ones that I now had to take on. And those classes were singly taught by this teacher, and the teacher was totally checked out and didn't really want to teach, didn't discipline the kids, didn't properly construct lessons. The lessons weren't engaging, et cetera, et cetera. I had to now construct new lessons for these classes. I had to deal with the unruly, unfocused kids, and amid, extremely a developmentally difficult time period for them. And I basically lost all empathy for students and approached the situation tyrannically. That was what I needed to do to stabilize the classes. This was energetically extremely expensive, and of course psychologically also very damaging, because I'm not I'm not really angry by disposition. Anger is a very rare emotion for me, and so my body reacts quite, there's physiological reactions to my own anger. And I was experiencing anger for about a month straight on a daily basis, quite intense. Well, this, conveniently enough, immunocompromised me. And I began to feel a little bit more feeble. You're on your feet all day. You're speaking a lot. You're yelling. I'm working after hours and things like that. And, I get this flu-like symptoms. I have to take a couple days off. We didn't really have any substitutes, so I was getting annoyed by the school and like, when are you coming back? I took 2 days off. I came right back, even though I really wasn't well enough to come back full throttle. It's not like you sit at your little desk and you type up, manipulate spreadsheets, right? You got to be student facing. You got to have eyes on all these 30 kids in the class. Again, teaching in middle school is very, very energetically expensive. Anyway, I, resumed my anger, and I got even more sick right after. It happened to be a very severe bout of pneumonia. I'd never had pneumonia before. I had severe symptoms. Severe. I was bedridden for 2 weeks. I was coughing up large amounts of phlegm and blood. I couldn't eat for days on end. I had vertigo while sitting still. I could barely sleep. I was losing weight. I was having, extremely dark thoughts. This was, February of 2020, at the end of, February to March. I had, I probably should have gone to the hospital, but, we were being advised not to because of this COVID outbreak that was just happening. And looking back on it, had I, shall we say, lost the will to live, I would have ceased to live. My body would have ceased viability. And this I was almost certain about. Now, one night I essentially pleaded to the universe itself, how can I get well? How can I get well, please? After I woke up after a horrible nightmare. This is one of these interdimensional nightmares. And the message I received was the function of the illness, which was a fundamental humbling. And this is one function of illness. But I started to think about illness metaphysically. I started to think, well, I knew about metacausation back then. I just hadn't put the pieces together. I hadn't really understood that symptomologies are actually that double as symbologies of programming. Now, the programming, once again, is proto-computational, involves all these, involves strato-syntax and different self-dual teledynamic operators whose body complexes are the only things being studied, and that's why we're so confused about why illnesses occur, why certain people get sick, why other people don't, while some people go into remission, some people the cancer recurs, etc. This all seems quite random and mechanical. It's a weird mixture. It's a randomized, mechanized sort of mixture. And that's because we haven't generalized body complexes to body mind spirit complexes, etc. I knew all that, but I hadn't integrated that. And I hadn't, made the connection that all the anger and lack of humility and lashing out and disdain for the teaching profession, the structure of school, for the students and beyond, because it was definitely extending to society. I mean, you look around society, and society is stupidly structured. And this is obvious, but this is not the correct approach. This approach is arrogant, and arrogance is it's an advanced form of ignorance. And this was something that I was also aware of mentally, but I wasn't actually reconfiguring my personality and my behaviors according to this. Now, of course, this might seem like, oh, well, if you step out of line and do bad things, then you get sick. It is not that simple. It is much subtler than that. Every single body, mind, spirit complex has unique proto-computational programming. Unique, which means that if you want to try to replicate experiments and studies, medical studies, you're going to come up short. You're never going to be able to. Now, of course, there are correlations and there are connections, but metacausation is neither mechanical nor randomized. And so, this is fundamentally going to prove frustrating to those of us who've been dealing with scientific method purely. And even the axiomatic method, actually, because axioms are not proven. They're just definitions that are stipulated into existence and can be as easily just, discarded as assumptions, right? Mathematics has no ontological power as it stands, right? Mathematics doesn't tell you why math exists, etc. Doesn't tell you why abstract objects or axioms exist, etc. So anyway, this is going to be fundamentally frustrating, but we have to also understand that the frustration is itself a symptom and a symbol. Of what? Well, you have to decide for yourself what it is in your case. But in my case, this pneumonia was fundamentally humbling, and I thought to myself, okay, well, I'm not trying to avoid illness. I want to learn from the programming. Okay, and since my mind complex, my conscious mind complex was not adequately registering the fact that I needed to reconfigure this personality attribute, namely arrogance, which led to anger and lashing out and disdain. It was given to my body. It was bestowed, shall we say, on my body complex. And it was bestowed in a way that it was extremely visceral and painful. Since then, I have proactively reconfigured that arrogance, converting it into humility, and of course, other, vortical virtues we can say of the open heart, namely appreciation and valor, because it took, the ancillary function was to induce valor on me. I've always been quite physically sensitive, but this was so comprehensively painful. I haven't really done it justice in how I described it, but it was so painful that I had to toughen up. I was kind of being a weakling in a way, in the way that I was approaching it. So, since then, I resolved to tightly and conscientiously tune my personality to my spirit complex programming. And this comes in the form of emotions, day-to-day emotions, which figure into intentions, which figure into perceptions. The perceptions, you can think of spirit complex configurations as emotions. Emotions then can be selectively reinforced through intentions. They're charged through intentions. We're using metaphorical language, of course. We want to access as many audiences as we can. And those intentions, when acted upon, well, first of all, they cause perceptions. And when acted upon, basically, correspond to interactions that then are receptions of those, they parameterize new emotions. And then we have this, metaphysical circulatory system, as it were, between emotions, perception, intentions, and perceptions. And this, circulatory system is something that I'm constantly tuning and titrating. Why? In service to others. I have my motivation has become completely intrinsic. And this is my unique case. I've always been very fulfilled with my circumstances, these familial and social circumstances, my physical body, the vitality of my physical body and the acuity of my mind. So ever since I was a kid, they used to make me paranoid. I'm so happy with my life, and I wasn't terribly privileged. I'm privileged in the sense that I have a very loving family, and I wasn't, starving day to day, and I had school to go to and things like that. And I wasn't in a war zone. I mean, these are, circumstantial parameters, but gestationally as well. My development was quite smooth. I was, athletic and, academically. Hell, let me not get into all that, but I was very fulfilled as a kid. And it took me a long time. This sort of led me to start just sort of fucking around with people and started, entertaining myself. And I talk about this in the Generalizing Love series, especially in the segment on humility. I think it's part 4. And until this pneumonia, 2020, what was I, 26? I, hadn't realized that my fulfillment was supposed to be converted into an intrinsic motivation to serve others in every single moment, however I can, however I deem desirable and necessary, however service is demanded, I am called on. And instead of seeking opportunities, I seek difficulties in order to ameliorate and assist in any way I can. Once again, because I am already intrinsically fulfilled. And that's a separate topic. If you want to learn more about that, check out the Generalizing Love series. Since I have been pouring my heart and soul into my teaching, into my day-to-day, moment-to-moment interactions with anybody, family, friends, acquaintances, people on the street, this has to do with, again, emotions, intentions, and perceptions. When I'm perceiving people on the train in the morning, I'm actively blessing them and wishing them well, marveling at the fact that they're alive with me and we're journeying together. When water comes out of the sink, I think to myself, wow, there's people who are filtering the water, people who have constructed the tubes, people who are, contributing orchestrally to something that is so simple and something that I can take for granted so easily. Any single amenity, accessory, need that I have and that is fulfilled is cause for appreciation and marvel. And since, retuning and titrating my personality in this way, which has been, hard work, my physical body has been quite vital and has not succumbed to any kind of physical illness or ailment. I have gotten injured, actually. I talked about that elsewhere on the channel, but those injuries were opportunities for self-healing and titrating different personality attributes as well. And that'll be, maybe in the next segment, I'll talk about how I had a rather complex injury on my pinky where I had a bony mallet finger. Basically, I had the extensor tendon was torn and it ripped off a fragment of the distal phalanx of my pinky here. Now it's fully healed and back to, it's back to its full strength. But that was what amounted to a 6-month injury because I opted for conservative treatment. Could have had surgery, but the fact of the matter is my pinky was, this distal phalanx is extremely delicate, and the possibility of complications and surgery causing either recurrence, weakening, or other kinds of deformities was quite high, above 50%. And so I opted for a conservative route. And I also have had many cuts, glass. I've cut my hand with a wine glass that shattered when I was washing it. I punctured my foot with a chip of glass that was sitting on the ground after we had ordered glasses, and one of them had a chip in it. We couldn't find it. Well, my foot found it. Let's see. I've had other injuries, interestingly, but no illnesses, despite teaching in a cesspool of bacteria and viruses, namely a school. And in February, if I have not fallen ill before then, it'll be 5 years, which is significant, and I'm very thankful. But the point is that the reason why I'm not becoming ill is precisely because I am pouring my heart and soul into service to others. In my case, that is conducing to physical vitality in the extreme. I need to be physically vital and mentally acute in order to actually properly teach. And I teach with fervor and care. Coupling intellectual stimulation and passion with empathy and compassion. And, well, I think this segment has run its course. We're going to pause and continue in the next segment. So, thank you so much, everyone, for listening. I hope that this was pleasant and, maybe even educational. See you later.